Hello and welcome to Forging a Minecraft Mod lecture number 5, entities. We've been talking about items and blocks and so on, but what is an entity? So comparing items and block with each other is quite simple. You can place a block in the world and an item you can have in your hand, etc. It's pretty much that. But how do we define an entity? People might say, well, an entity is something that moves, which is not entirely true, because paintings are entities as well. And, well, a block can sort of move. You can, well, remove it from one location and put it in another location. So, an entity is probably more, well, better defined as something that is not a part of the usual, well, one's cube meter grid. So it might be a bit of a vague description, but we'll take a closer look on what it is, and I hope you'll understand better. So there's a small description there. Let's get going into Eclipse. So as you might see, if you have a good eye, if I zoom you'll see better, I have a few arrows here in a package called client. And what this is model spaceship and render spaceship. These two files I've prepared already. I'm going to make an entity, and I've already prepared how this entity is going to be rendered, its model and the code for rendering it. The reason why I've done this is because it takes some time to make, and this is further going to be discussed in the course An Anatomy of a Minecraft Model. So it's a bit beyond this course, but you still need to be able to work with entities and know how to assign models and so on for this entity, but I've prepared them already. If you're watching this live, you can get those two files together with the two textures I'm going to use in the chat. If you're watching this recorded, you can get them all as a part of the source on the lecture page. And the reason why I have an arrow here is because it's trying to refer to entity spaceship, which is what we're going to create. So we'll fix that error soon. So that's right, we're going to create a spaceship. I think that's fun. So to start off, I'm going to create a package here for entities. A package, and that's going to be an example. And here I want entities, like so. Right. It shouldn't be a... where do I have that? So I'm just going to rename it. I misspelled it. I should have a lowercase e. So you can just click rename and it's going to do that for us. There you go. Sorry about that. And I want a new class called Entity Spaceship. So let's get going creating this spaceship. Right. So what do we do? Well, it's well a common thing to do with all these things. When we make an item, we extend item. When we make a block, we extend block. When we make a tile entity, we extend tile entity. And obviously, when we make a entity, we extend entity, like so. And we want to pick the Minecraft one. Then we, of course, need a constructor. And if we let Eclipse create that for us, we're going to see that it requires a world object here. So when you create a well, a block or an item, you get the ID to use for it. For an entity, we get the world, so we need to know where to spawn it. And the same thing for us with I'm going to add some unimplemented methods here that we do require. The same thing that goes with tile entities is that we're going to create a new instance of this entity each time we spawn it. So it's not like blocks that we have one base block that we always refer to. It's not like items where we have one base item that we always refer to. Then of course we can make item stacks with that it is referring to that item, so we can have multiple stacks of that item. But for entities, what we have is, if we have a creeper in your house, and a creeper in your friend's house, and a creeper falling in the air from your friend's house, then we have 3 different instances of this entity. So that means that we can have fields that is unique to each and every of these entities. So we can easily just change those values, because usually entities have a ton of values, like where they're heading, like their position, their velocity, maybe a lot of fields defining their behavior. Is the creeper going to explode, blah blah blah, and things like that. So they are quite heavy when it comes to data. And a tile entity is sort of a light version of an entity. That's why they have the same name, sort of. A tile entity is sort of an entity specifically made to give the block a bit of extra information. So that's the tiles entity. However, a tile entity and an entity is not the same thing, so it's not like the entity extends tile entity or the tile entity extends entity. It's just that they are called sort of the same thing because they work a bit similarly. So they are not the same thing, but that's why they have similar names. So this is actually the only thing I'm going to do for the spaceship to start with. And if we save it now, we'll see that we lost all the errors. So the only error we had was basically, alright, you're trying to refer to a spaceship, but there's no such thing. But like I said, this is the only thing I need at the moment. Then I'm going to create a new class, just to, well, keep track of things. This is in the entity package as well. Entities, like so. And here, this is just going to use to create the entities and so on. So I void init. Okay, so for blocks we had to register, for tile entities we had to register, for items we didn't, and what do you think it is for entities? Well, for entities we also need to register them. So we have public static void init, and I want to register the spaceship. How do I do this? Well, I refer to entity registry, like so, and hit register. And here we can see we have 4 different ways of registering this entity. We can register mod loader entity. We shouldn't do that at all. That's something all. It's marked as all. Don't use this. It's just still there for compatibility. Then we have 2 versions of register global entity ID. That means that we can register our entity as a global entity. That means that it's going to be registered as if it would be a vanilla entity. However, if we do it like that, we can run out of, well, IDs. All the mods are going to share their IDs. So it's much better to just register it as a mod entity. That means that we can specify which mod it belongs to, and the ID we have to give to it only has to be unique for us. So if we refer to our own mod, register multiple entities, then we just make sure that those IDs are different. We don't have to bother about conflicting with other mods. So obviously these are not the variables we want. What we want is entity spaceship here, class, like so, and then we have entity spaceship, like that. An ID, it has to be unique, so I'll go with 0. The mod, which mod are we using? Well, Steve's example, but we want the instance of the mod, and that's easy. We have a field they called instance. If we take a look, it's this one that we set up the very first lecture, like that. And then we need to give it a few more values. We need to be able to tell how far we can reach it. I'm not entirely sure which values are good. I usually use 80, and I usually use 3 for how often it should be updated, and then we need true there. So the last part here is if the client should be notified about the current velocity that the entity on the server side has. These different values you might want to have different depending on how often you need this entity to be updated, how far we need to be able to update it from, blah blah blah. I'm not an expert on what values are good there. I'm usually going with 80 and 3 because that's being used by some of the vanilla entities. But if you is more interested about those values, you can of course take a look on the vanilla entities and see sort of their different values with those there. But it's basically how far we can reach it with the code, and well, how far we can track it and how often it will be updated. So we register a mod entity here, and a question in the chat, well, is why would we then use a global entity? And I spent a few hours yesterday to try to figure that out, but I'm not entirely sure why you would want a global entity when you can just make a mod one. And there's probably something good with it, but I couldn't really find that. So for now, I'm happy with just registering a mod entity. Then of course we will need to head over to Steve's example, the mod file itself, and do entities dot init. So just calling that method, otherwise it wouldn't register it. I'm doing that from the init part, so the fml initialization event, and that's going to make sure that this code runs and that will register the spaceship. Right, so that's pretty much it for creating the entity, but we want some graphics, and now we're going to head over to something that we haven't used from lecture 1. It's the client proxy. Here, if you remember that one, we had a common proxy and a client proxy, and we called the proxy from the mod file when we first started the mod. But on the on the server side, we would just have a common proxy. So therefore, if I open that one, we would just run these empty ones. Whereas on the client side, we would have a client proxy, so we would run these guys, and that's the whole point. Now I can register some rendering stuff here, and that will only happen on the client side. And we have only already set that up, in the first lecture, so we already have the proxies ready. And what I'm going to do now is just do rendering registry. So we need to register the rendering code here, and then we need to do register entity rendering handler, like so. So we need to register which sort of renderer that is going to keep track of all the rendering stuff for our entity. And the thing we need to do here is give it the class again, like we did when we registered the entity itself, like that. And then we need to give it a renderer spaceship. So what is this rendering thingy? Well, that's one of the files that I prepared already. And what it will do is render this for us. If we can take a quick look into that file, but like I said, it's going to be covered more in depth later on in the course, specifically about models and rendering stuff. We basically tell it to render the spaceship doing some different things, but the major thing is actually just to render the model itself, and the model here is something I prepared already. It's quite a lot of code there. So like I said, this is not a part of this course, but it's a part of the course to know how to register different renderers, so that's why these two are already prepared. So there we go, we register it like that. So that's done in the client proxy, and then we of course also need to register the entity itself. So those are two different things, registering the entity and registering what's going to render the entity. Right, so that's pretty much it. We have the code, we register it, and we register the mod entity. But it might be a good idea to be able to spawn this entity, otherwise, well, what's the point with it? So I'm going to head over to an old friend, the Wand from lecture number 2. You know, the one that shot enemies up into the air, or well, mobs, or well, living entities, if you so wish. But that's not what we wish to do now. What we wish to do now is override another method. And this is a method we've seen before. It's a method used in lecture number 3, if I'm not mistaken, when we use the cards to change the state of the machines, the machine blocks. And what it does is basically allows us to do things, run some code when you right-click on a block, and we get a ton of parameters here. Let's go to write them all. Oops. Hit Y, there you go. There you go. So if you don't remember what all of these do, we have the item stack that the player used, we have the player that did so, we have the world where we are, we have the coordinates of this block, we have the side the player clicked on, and then we have the location of that side, well, the position inside that side. So it will be like 0.5 if you clicked in the exact middle and so on. Yeah, that's that. And what are we going to use this for? Well, we're going to use this for one specific thing. We're going to spawn this spaceship on the ground. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, it's fairly simple actually, but first we need to make sure one thing. You should know this. What should we make sure when we spawn this spaceship? It's easy. We need to check that we are on the server side. We shouldn't spawn it on the client side. We should spawn it on the server side, and the server will take care of the rest, like that. But I want to do another thing. This is totally optional, but I want to make sure that the player is sneaking. Why do I want to do this? Well, this wand is sort of a combat wand. You might want to shoot enemies up into the air, so spawning a spaceship, well, might be something you don't want to do in combat by mistake, so I'm forcing you to shift right click on the ground to spawn this spaceship. That's totally optional, and it doesn't have anything to do with the spawning code at all. So how do we spawn this? Sorry, I need to return false first and return true here. And what this is just a part of onItemUseFirst. If we want to spawn a spaceship, we don't want to interact with the block that we spawned it on. If we didn't want to spawn it, then we want to interact with the block. So therefore we return false. But the spawning code, sorry, got distracted. Entity spaceship. So first of all, we need to create a new instance of this entity. Like I said before, as it is with tile entities, we have a new instance of it each time we have a version of this entity. So if we want to create two different spaceships, then what we do is that we create two instances of this class of this spaceship. So there we go, that's the first step of two. We have a middle step which is optional, and that is to modify some parts of this entity. And I'm going to modify its position, which makes perfect sense, otherwise it's, well, going to spawn in the void. But yeah, it's still optional. You can like set it in the constructor if you make a constructor like that, and so on. Observe that you need a constructor which is as simple as this one. The client is going to use that one. So if you make another constructor, you still need to leave a constructor with only the world. But, well, that's usually not something you have to bother too much about. There you go. So I'm just going to set the position depending on where which block we collect. If we click on the bottom of a block or a side of a block, it might be a bit weird with where it's being placed, but we could of course prevent it prevent the user from spawning it by clicking on the bottom, because, well, that would be a bit weird. Like, where would the ship spawn? Should it spawn floating in the air below and then fall down or whatnot? So that depends on what you want, but we have the side here, so if you want to, you can just prevent it from being spawned when clicked on the side. It's fairly easy. Then what we want to do is just spawn this. So we have two things. Like I said, we have the creation of the entity instance, so we just create a new instance. Then this is an optional part to modify a ton of things, and then we had the second part, which is to spawn it like this. So we just refer to the world and do dot spawn entity in world and give it the entity. This is going to spawn the entity inside the world. So what that means is it's basically going to take the entity, put it into the world, and boom, I'm done. So let's see, we're actually done here. We have registered the entity, we have created the entity, even though it didn't contain much. We have registered the rendering part of it, and we have done this. We have added a code which is going to spawn it. It's fairly simple, this spaceship. It doesn't fly, it doesn't do anything, it's just there. But if everything works alright, we should still get a spaceship at position when we right click, or well, when we shift right click. So hopefully we can take a look on this when Minecraft decides to start. Here we go. I'm going to create a new world called Lecture 5, and take a look on this wand and what we can do with it. Of course we can do what we did before, but now we've added more functionality. If you want an item, however, that is specifically made for just this ship item, it's fairly simple to do so. It is basically do the same thing that we did, but instead of just spawning it, you would spawn it and decrease the amount of items you have. So basically you placed it. Okay, so we go to combat, where we can find the wand of the rocket, and if I shift right click, boom, we get a spaceship here. So the reason why it looks like it does is obviously the rendering code, and that was something I had already prepared. But if you want, you can of course take a look on that, or you can wait for course 5, the anatomy of a Minecraft model, where we'll take a look on how you can do these yourself. We can run straight through it, of course, so it's not a very good spaceship because we can't enter or anything. Like that. But, you know, it's a start. So what can we do when we have an entity? Well, we can add a ton of code to it, obviously. So what I'm going to do is allow us to ride it. Just ride it, just sit in it, nothing more than that. So what I'm going to do is set size in the constructor there, and what this does is setting its bounding box size, sort of. So we have a 1.5 times 1.5 square, and then the height of that square, so it turns into a cuboid, is 0.6. So that's sort of going to give us a cuboid bounding box, its size. But that's just the bounding box that we have kept track of, or well, the entity will know of. We'll also actually have to define that this is indeed our bounding box. So therefore I'm going to override get bounding box and tell it that something called bounding box is a bounding box. So it might seem a bit silly, but basically what happens here is that when we set the size, we're going to do some calculations, and in the end we're going to get a bounding box here. And by default we don't have any collision or bounding boxes at all, so even if we set that as a bounding box, we still need to return it here. Axis aligned BB is basically axis aligned bounding box. So that means that we have a bounding box that is aligned to the different axes in the Minecraft world. That's just what it's called, so it doesn't really matter too much. After that we also need to define another method called, well, it's also going to return a axis aligned bounding box, get collision box. So we want to know how this entity collides with another entity. Of course, these are not methods you have to override. It's the same thing with items and blocks and so on. We have a ton of different yeah, it's not returning anything. A ton of different methods that we can override depending on what we want to do. If we want to get a spaceship that we can collide with and activate and ride in, we have to give it a proper bounding box. But if you want something else, like a painting that you can walk straight through, then you obviously don't want the bounding box where you can, well, collide with it. So what I want to do here is basically return the bounding box of the entity, the other entity. What this means is that this entity here, when it tries to collide with another entity, we just get the bounding box from that one, and then if my bounding box collides with the others, then we have a collision. Then don't let them get any closer, push them away from each other if they're too close, blah blah blah. However, we'll get an issue here. If a player is riding in this entity, we're going to get an issue between the rider and the spaceship, because on the client side, I'm not entirely sure why this happens on the client side only, but the client side, on the client side, these two things will collide when you sit in it, and when they collide, it's going to give us very weird behaviors. We're going to see the spaceship just jumping back and forth between two positions, because the client is going to move it upwards and then the server is going to move it back down again. So a very easy solution to this is to check that there's something called written by entity, and we're going to use that later as well, and that's basically the entity that's currently riding this entity. So if we have someone riding the spaceship, we will get that person in written by entity. However, that might be null, and that's totally possible. Return, and here I'm going to return null. Speaking of null, so what I have here is, well, if it's any other entity, then return its proper bounding box. However, if it's the person riding the spaceship, return null. I don't want the spaceship to be able to collide with that person. That is just weird. If you're sitting in it, then you're sitting in it. Leave it at that. And we need a few more methods before we can do something. And what I want to do here is public boolean can be collided with. And even though it says can be collided with, what we're going to use this for is actually if we can interact with it, if we can right click on it. And it's fairly simple, the algorithm here. We want to be able to click on it as long as it's not dead. So there's a field called is dead in entity, and that's what we're going to use. If this entity is still alive, we can right click on it. What's happening when we right click on it? Well, we'll have to define that, of course, but now we're defining that we can sit in it. Right, and then I need to override something else, the interaction thingy. So this makes perfect sense what it does. It's going to allow us to do things when a player interacts with this entity. However, its name does not make sense. It's one of these that haven't been named, so it's 130002_C, like that, and we get the player. And what I want to do is, first of all, of course, make sure that we're on the server side, and second of all, I want to make sure that there's no one riding it, this spaceship. So if we are on the server side and this spaceship is empty, what do we want to do? Well, I would think that we want to place the player that interacts with it inside the spaceship. That would make sense, right? So how do we do this? Is it tricky? Do we have to do a lot of code? No, it's very, very simple. We just do player.mount entity, and then we give it the spaceship. So we just tell the player you should sit here, and that is being handled. And we need to return true that we actually did something here. There we go. We have one more method that we need to use, and that's yes for aesthetics double get mounted y offset. So where do we want the player to sit compared to the spaceship, or well, compared to the default location of sitting? And I'm going to just move it down 0.15 meters. Why would I want to do that? Well, it looks good. It's so I want to place the player properly inside the spaceship itself. And that's about it. Now we've actually made something we can ride. It's very easy to do so, and a lot of things is very easy to do just because a lot of code already exists there. We don't have to define how we mount an entity. We can just well, tell it to do so. We don't have to define which entity is riding this. We don't have to define how to calculate the bounding box. We just set the size and then use the bounding box that we get. So it's fairly straightforward in many cases what we want to do. So let's take a look at what we have now for the spaceship. Okay, so there you go. I can now sit in it. Sweet. And I'm sitting in a pretty good location. I'm not sitting inside the floor, like that. And I can shift click to get out. That's just the default behavior in Minecraft these days. So that's nothing we need to implement ourselves. So there you go. We can sit in this spaceship. It's not really moving much, but we can still sit there. obviously the next thing I want to do is make it movable. I'm not going to allow you to control the movement because that's going to require more code, but I'm just going to give a simple example of how we can move entities around. It's fairly simple, but we'll need to keep a few things in mind. On update, so this is going to happen each time it updates, which is fairly often. We've told it how often it should update when we registered it. On update like that. So we need to call the stupid class code so that one can do its update code. But then when we've done that, we can do all of the things. So what do we want to do first? We want to move this spaceship. You should know this. We should check that we are on the server side. The server side is going to control the movement. And what I want to do is, depending on a few things, I want to set in motion a bit differently. So what I want to check is if we have a rider here, written by entity. If that's not null, that means that someone is sitting in it. Maybe it's you, maybe it's your friend, maybe it's a cow, but someone is sitting there, or standing, or well, it's in there at least. And if that's the case, then I want this to go upwards. So I'll set the motion to 0.2. Then I think we should move it down if someone isn't in it, so we can get it back to the ground. But we shouldn't move it down if we're already on the ground. So what I want to do is make sure that that we actually have an air block below us. If we don't have an air block below us, we shouldn't move downwards, obviously. And Eclipse is just moving my cursor now. I'm sorry. Position X, and then we have position Y -1, and finally. Like that. So what I have here is basically checking if the air block below us is well, that there is an air block below us, because well, the position of this entity can be anything. It can be like we are at Y 25.321, but obviously we just have a block each cube meter, so that's why we have to convert it to an integer. So that's sort of what I spoke about, that entities can move around more freely. They are not really restricted to the cube grid. So that's what we'll have to do here. This calculation is not the best to check that we have an air block below us, just because, well, we might want to check for multiple blocks. Now we are checking for one. We might check like I don't know, 6 blocks below us. We might have multiple blocks that we might stay on, and so on. So it's not the best of calculations, but it's going to do the trick quite well. But like I said, it's not going to be perfect. So we're going to move it downwards, and otherwise we're going to set it at 0 like that. And the next thing that we would want to do is actually to use this motion. The motion is something that exists for an entity, and that might be modified with something by something else, sorry. But we still have to tell it that it should move and how it should move. And we do this quite easily. We just set the position to be the position we're currently at, and then we, well, add its motion. And I'm going to do that in all dimensions, just for completeness. So if we want to change this later, then it's going to work. Maybe if we're going to be affected by something else, someone is pushing us away, a tornado is, well, doing things, you know. So what we have here, we're just setting the position. However, we're not just modifying position X, position Y, and position Z like so. We're actually using set position. It's going to do a few other things. It's going to change the bounding box properly, and yeah, do a ton of different things. So don't just change the position. You call set position. That's going to do more work. It's going to make sure that everything works properly. So let's take a look on how this thing looks now. We're controlling everything on the server side, so the client should just be getting information from the server, and everything should look fine, and you know. Okay, so to move this up. There we go. If I take a seat here, it's going to start moving upwards. But this looks terrible. Why is the spaceship doing this? Well, what's happening is the following. On the server side, we're going to synchronize. Let's get out of here. On the server side, we're going to check which motion we should have, and then we send that information to the client. We're not sending this to the client all the time, because that would be terrible. That would mean a ton of information, and that means that it is going to hack, like in these different stages, just because, well, the server synchronizes it once in a while, and then it's going to move on the client side. The client side doesn't know anything about the movement, so that's why it looks like it does. A very simple way of fixing this is actually to tell the client to move as well. We still control it all on the server side, so the server side controls what motion we should have, but both the server and the client moves. Why does this work? Well, like when we registered the entity, said, well, send a velocity, so we wanted it to update the velocity and make sure that the player the entity on the client side also received the velocity, and that allows us to set the position of the client side as well. This is how it's going to look much smoother than it did before. So if we take a seat now, it's bumping a bit still, but it's going much smoother, and if I get out of it, it's going to go very smooth when I'm not there, bumping it all the time. There we go. So as you can see, it's much smoother. It's not perfect, and entities like the boat and the minecarts that are very complex, their code to make them move as smooth as possible. They have, of course, much more code to fix this, but we've made a very simple code to make it very smooth. Even though it's not perfect, it's still very smooth. If you want to make it even better, you can take a look in how the boat and the minecart does it, but for now I'm going to be satisfied with this, otherwise we won't be able to cover anything more in this lecture. Okay, that's that. We can move it and all. But now I want to do a few more things. What if I want to have two different types of spaceship? One that is this place when this wand is being charged. You know, if you use the wand 10 times, it's getting charged, and then you can spawn. Then you could use it for shooting away entities in an arc instead of just shooting them right up. But what if we want to have a different texture or a different ship if we spawn a charged one? And this might sound a bit silly, but we will see a few different things that we'll have to keep in mind when we do so. So without further ado, let's get going. So what I need to do is obviously add a field here called, well, it doesn't have to be called charged, but it needs to be keeping track of if it's charged or not. And the methods I'm going to use here is charged. It's going to return charged. And then I'm going to use public void set charged. There we go. Charged equals true. So there you go. So I just have two methods, one to get it and one to set it as charged. And how do I want to do this? Well, of course I want to do this in the wand. And we've seen how I have done this before when we actually used the charged level up here. So if it was charged and we wanted to shoot the mob away from us and then reset the item damage, otherwise we would increase the item damage. So I'm just going to do the same thing here. If is charged, that's that method up there. Stack dot get item damage, so that's the item damage of the wand. Then if it is, then we want to set the item damage to 0, so that resets it. Set item damage 0. And otherwise we want to increase the item damage, so stack dot set item damage stack dot get item damage +1. So far there's nothing new. We just say if it's charged, reset it. If it's not, increase it by 1. And the rest is not going to be that new either. We're just going to do ship dot set charged. Nothing more than that. So now we set it, and it's fine. That's everything we need in here. We just say if it's charged, reset it, but also set the ship that we're spawning to charged. Okay. How do we set different textures? Well, like I said, I'm not going to cover exactly what's going on in here, but I'm still going to edit some of this code. As we can see here, we're loading something called a resource location, but more to that in later courses. We're loading two different textures, one called spaceship.png and one called spaceship charge.png, and those are the files that I've already prepared in my texture folder. And here we return which texture to use. So at the moment I just wanted to know that we have two different textures here that we have loaded, and here we return which texture to use. How do we make, well, the charged one look different? Well, it's fairly simple. What I need to do is to spell right, otherwise it won't work. well, I want to convert the entity to entity spaceship. I know it is one of those, and then I want to say is charged, and if it's charged I want to return the charged texture, otherwise I want to return a normal one. Obviously if we wanted the model to change completely, like give it other model parts like bigger wings or whatnot, I don't know, then we would have to do it in a more advanced way, but at the moment I just want to change the texture, and therefore it's this easy. If it's charged, return one texture, otherwise return the other texture as well. Okay, what's the next part? Well, it won't really work with what we have now. We will set it for sure, but will it reach the client? No, it's not. Take a look in the wand. When we create it, we are just supposed to create it on the server side. Therefore, when we set that it's charged, that information is never going to reach the client, and therefore we won't be able to render it properly. So how do we fix this? Well, there's an interface from Forge Mod Loader, which is very nice to have. Implement iEntity. Here we go. iEntity additional spawn data, and that's just amazing. We obviously need to add its methods, so I'm going to tell Eclipse to do so, and the two methods are write spawn data and read spawn data. So what this interface does is that it allows us to send along extra information when this entity is being created. So what I have now is that I want to tell the server to send some extra information to the client. And how do I do this? Well, I refer to the data object here in write spawn data. So I want to write extra information that can later on be read. So data.write. Here I can write a ton of things. I can write bytes, I can write Boolean values, I can write chars, I can write doubles, integers, longs. I can write a ton of different things here. Strings in different formats. What I want to write is a Boolean value, and I want to write if it's charged. So I want to write that to this data thing here. All that data that I write, I can write more things here. I can just do data.write write I don't know, double 3.2. I can write just a ton of things, but I'm just going to be satisfied with that Boolean value there, and that data is going to send along to the client side, and we're going to receive it here as a byte array data input. It's going to be the same data, but it's a different object there. And what we can do then is just do the opposite. So we can do data.read boolean like that. Observe that we don't give it any keys or anything. So we need to make sure that we read the exact same things in the exact same order. If we don't do that, it's going to be messed up. So we write the data in a specific order and we read it in the exact same order. So that's how we keep track of the information. So the same order all the time, and it's going to be fine. There you go. So by implementing this interface, we know that these two methods are going to be called. This is on the server side, and we can write extra information. This is on the client side, and that's going to read the extra information and store it on the client side. However, we might have forgotten one thing, and that is what happens when we close the world. it's going to lose if it's charged or not, and we don't want that. But this read entity from MBT that we had to implement is the exact same thing, or well, it works exactly the same as the read from MBT that we had in the tile entity. So what I'm going to do here in the right one is to say compound.setBoolean charged, that's its name, remember, we need a name here, and then we give it the value. So this is on the server side, this is only on the server side, both of these, but we're using these when the world is closed. Well, when you shut down the world, then we obviously want to save things, and then we want to load them back again using read entity from NBT. But this is not enough. We need to do the supercalls here to make sure that it saves its position and everything properly. So read from NBT, we send the compound along like that. Oh no, actually, I'm sorry. That's sorry. I mixed things up. You're not supposed to do it here. For tile entities, you're supposed to do it not here. It's saved in a different location in entity. So I'm sorry. You shouldn't add anything more here. You just read the things you want and you write the things you want. So now a question for you. So we do this and we synchronize the data when we place the entity. How are we supposed to make sure that the client receives the saved information? How are we supposed to do that? Because, well, we save it on the server side, and when it's placed we synchronize it to the client. But how do we synchronize it later? Like, we don't know when the player joins. And this is actually just a trick question. We don't have to do anything at all. What it does is, each time it spawns, we send the information. The client, when the client joins, it's going to see, oh right, I have an entity here of this type. I ask the server, what information should I have? The server gives it the correct information. So even if it spawns after the world has closed and loaded again, it's simply just going to send the information anyway. So it's very, very easy to use the entity additional spawn data here, just because it's automatically sorry, can't speak, I need to drink something, when the client requires some information, and well, when an entity is being spawned, it's going to get like the position and the motion and which entity it is and so on. But if we want to synchronize something extra, we can do so like this. And then we can run it, and hopefully what we will see now is that the one is going to spawn this with a charged type, and if when it does, it's going to be synchronized to the client, and the side is going to draw it differently. So if I place a lot of spaceships here, if I shift click as well, that was one of the requirements, we can see that it's going to charge up how many times we have used this. And I place it up on top of the grass 9 times, and you can be the 10th. There you go. Alright, that doesn't work in creative mode. There you go. So now it's charged here. What happens if I boom, right click it this time? So now it was reset to 0, and we have a different type. We have a red type here, and that's just because that's the charge type. It's still not perfectly smooth, like I said, but it works a bit better. And if we close down and log in again, we'll see the red ship up there. Nice, and that's because we saved information on the server side, but we also have the entity additional spawn data interface, which is going to make sure that the data is synchronized to the client side when it's being spawned, and when we load the world again, it's actually being spawned, another entity is being spawned, but it get all the information that we did save, and therefore it will still be the red version instead of the gray version that we can see in the distance. That's about it for now. We'll see more nifty things that we can do with entities after the break, so I'll see you in about 15 minutes.